Actually, I wanted to get hidden behind Fedor's broad shoulders, but I will get hidden behind this desk. Okay. Fedor, hello. May I have my presentation, please? All right. Yes, we have the presentation, and I even have a great thing we call clicker. So in the 20 years of my experience in game localization, I have got the view that game localization is kind of orphan child. Somebody asks me, what do you do? What's your occupation? And I say, I am a translator and editor. And what do you translate? If I say I translate books, they will tell me, oh, that's cool. And if I say I am a localizer, they will say, well, maybe it's cool. But if I say that I localize games, they will say, all right, I sometimes play games, but there's nothing cool about it. And those who don't play games, they say, oh, why do you need to translate games at all? And partially, yeah, it works. So partially, this orphan situation of game localization as an industry has to do with the chaotic kind of situation, because this is a literature translation, but not literature translation. This is IT localization, but not IT localization. This is a whole lot of marketing, but not only marketing. I have met colleagues who travel or who move to game localization from literature translation, but they did not cope. As you can see, our sphere is the most complicated one. Why is it so, and what is typical about our sphere? Firstly, we have a mixed kind of style. So on the one hand, we are creative guys, and we make literature translation, but on the other hand, we must stick with all the requirements of localization. So we must, for example, avoid gender and so on and so forth. But unlikely many other spheres of translation, we cannot, for example, make a glossary beforehand. Every time we get a task for translation, and the information on what we actually are supposed to translate is so we learn about it only in the process, over the process of translation, and it is only in the process of the translation when we understand what shall be translated, how, and this can be done within a team, and further will help me to tell about it, I hope. And another thing, context. A game exists within a context normally. On the one hand, there are some older versions of the games, and no matter how we would want to translate mount differently, if he was a mount, he will remain mount in the newer version. On the other hand, if we have a game that follows a film or a book, we must also follow a game or a book. And if we have a Harry Potter game, we must stick to Warner Brothers version of the film. And if Bezoar was translated as Viazarova Kamin, so if it was translated as Biazar, we must stick to this particular version or option of the interpretation. And there is a gamer community. And they also argue about how we shall translate some terms. You shall translate event as event, because there is a pirate kind of, or like an illegal kind of translation, and we have been using this translation for 10 years. Otherwise, we will take insult and just won't buy anything from you. All right, let's come to the next slide. All right, what do we have? What do we have in terms of text work? So what do I do? On the one hand, we have this mixed kind of style. On the one hand, it is a literary translation with all those tips and tricks and all the language games. Sometimes we need to deal with jokes or poetry and so on and so forth. On the other hand, we have a gamer. He's got no time to read or to think. He or she must realize that this button means shoot, this button means run, this button means sword, and so on and so forth. So we need to take this particular sword and run. On the other hand, all the localization terms or all the localization requirements are in a sequence. So this is what the literature translators don't have. If, for example, a gamer shall kill gray wolves and he or she realizes that these are not gray wolves, they will be just distracted and they will be unhappy. Then we have the length restriction. For example, we have 1,000 English digits, and we must stick to this particular number, and we must consider that Cyrillic digits are heavier than English digits. And I was one time supposed to translate a whole lot of furniture items, and I was about to stick with 15 digits or symbols. Then we speak about variables, and our lines look like this. Somebody has killed somebody and has got something in return. So this must be in the nominative, as you can guess. And avoidance of the gender. This is my pain, and I must mention it separately because it is really a pain. All right, let's go. The style. On the one hand, we have a game setting. We have game setting where you are not yourself. You are a warrior or special agent or a little girl with candy or a lollipop or somebody else. So you need to be addressed the appropriate way, and you speak in the appropriate style. So if you come from some fantasy reality, you cannot curse, which many translators actually forget about. So have a look. Here is a setting. You have accomplished a big quest, and you are given a big sword. This is a sword with, this is an ancient sword with great, great in gravity. So you have traveled from the setting to the meta text.
So this sword adds 12 to strength and 7 to agility. This text has to be as concise and understandable to the player as possible. So that's why we avoid repetition. We use synonyms, we use metaphors and indirect descriptions. So in meta text, unlike in the literature, in meta text everything has to be very strict and clear, understandable. Talking about machine translation, meta text is something that the machine could translate, and I would gladly push this job to machines. But so far, people are still cheaper to hire, and that's why we hire them. Then the proper sequence of translation. We translated from writer list. But if the same game, the vagabond meets a thief, it's not going to be so good. If they don't, if they meet in a film setting, it will be even worse than a book, because you may be very confused. Oh, maybe a thief and a vagabond is the same, or is it a rogue and the thief is the same? But if you're in a cinema setting, you can't rewind back to get some proper understanding. But still, you have to avoid confusion between different beasts like gray wolves and horses. Now, the term, the vocabulary. We may have a vocabulary of 2,000 items of weapons, 1,000 items of skills and perks and scrolls, and you name it, a whole bunch of items, proper names, location names, and you have to translate all of that in a proper sequence, because in one place it's a list, in another place of the game it's just a dialogue that tells you go there and fetch me that, and you have to keep in mind what are you translating, what is this text in the, where is it in the game? It's in the text editor for you, but it's somewhere in the game. Then the vocabulary of terms, so glossary. You know, it's a tricky thing because a new patch is released and you can't always think of all the vocabulary ahead of time, because during the Game of Thrones there was a Coda person, character. We meet him in the first season, and then the next time in the 5th we find out that his name stems from the hold the door as a saying, and we finally realized that initially we couldn't translate it as an engineer because it's a door holder. So door holder is a thing. We have many of such names, weird names that don't come clear for us until somewhere later in the game. So you have to figure it out and communicate between translator and editor, translator and manager, because manager has to convince the contractor, the customer, that no, Cyrillics, you can't expect the same effect from Cyrillic. If we on the other hand translate all the terms in the Latin, it's not going to be right. It's not going to look well. Can we please translate them in Cyrillic and keep these great names the way we translated them? And you have to convince the customer. Another question. So, do we again? What is the word to use? Is it an inventory or is it your kit? Is it the charisma as a character trait, or is it sociability? Because theoretically, when you translate a steed, then it's a steed, but it's a wild animal. Is it a fantasy setting? Then probably it's a mounted or a mount. But it's not only a horse that can be a mount. A dragon can also be a mount in a game, and a motorbike can be a mount. But then you have to be careful about the verbs, because your dragon doesn't ride and your motorbike doesn't breathe fire. So the proper sequence concerns also the cliches in a language. Again, we are doing this in a raid, in a very quick set of actions. So we have to understand, in a game I pick up an item. What is it? What kind of item? Can I replace my shield with this shield, or should I not do that? So when we're doing a raid in a game, a translator must understand that a health plus 20 increases your health points by 20, and you have 20 plus points to your vitality. The translator has to know what is that particular thing he's translating. So time limitations, the length restrictions, all localization professionals have seen that. It's always a challenge. And the first thing I want to say, shortening things is for sissies. It's better to avoid shortenings by using more compact syntax and more compact terms. That's why we don't always have fighting, we have a battle, not a probability but a chance. Unfortunately, I met such translations, I've encountered such translations of texts where words like you have to, or you require, or it is, or it can be found, they were translated in full length for some reason. But words like strength or experience or health and other key words for this phrase, for some reason they cut them. This is a huge mistake. So if you cut something, you have to be consistent with it. If you cut like click to or roll to damage, if you choose one type of abbreviation for something, please be consistent and don't use another abbreviation in another place. So just an example, this is the kind of text that I get sometimes as a job done to edit and to proofread. So what you have here is the phrase had a limitation of length, 300 symbols. In the end, the translator tried to use as many shortenings as he could. But syntax was not so compact. Look at what he had in this case. He didn't work on the syntax properly. Let me just hold a little bit while you're reading the text. The syntax must be absolutely compact, concise, and it should use only standardized cliches. When a player in the game can quickly skim the text, get the keywords out of this paragraph, and be able to quickly understand what's happening and what basically this text tells him. I switch the slide, right? Now my favorite quote-unquote thing. Just yesterday, when I was heading out to this conference, I was looking for a video as an example, and there was an interesting ad which said, Wanderlust is in English, or I'm missing the translation, because in Ukrainian the word I'm missing has a gender ending, because I'm a girl, and I meet so many texts in Ukrainian where the Ukrainian writers avoid gender endings, and I've encountered in a game or in a shop a diary, a notebook, but it's clearly for girls because it looks like kind of pink and with flowers, and it says right here what you want to become in the future. But in Ukrainian it sounds the verb has a gender ending, and I see a male gender ending. So Once at a seminar, we were given a checklist. What should we expect as a copywriter? And we have a girl audience. There were 10 females coming over to learn copywriting. But the text said, what have I done so far? Have done was used with a gender ending for males. And I was just a little upset about it. And I wrote something to the author of the course, but she banned me in return. She didn't like my criticism. So what we have here, first we address the player, and the player can be any gender. Secondly, a player can select any character or NPC of any gender, especially if we talk about not a gender selection, but if a gender is tied to a specific class, because you can't have a dwarf of certain type male, and you have to keep that in mind. So if we have a NPC addressing a female character, the NPC should use the proper gender nouns, gender pronouns. And if you say in Ukrainian or Russian, what have you brought me, using a female pronoun or ending, whereas it's a male character, that will create not just a sexism in your text, but just inappropriate text. Sometimes you just don't know what the character says, and sometimes we don't know what we get as a material. We take some text and we put this text into a mouth of a specific character, but we cannot know at the moment what gender, what grammar we should use right now. So what kind of methods we use? Presens historicum, that's what we use. It's a non-player, name of the player enters the room. So I test run it with a screwdriver and Masha. This is a play of words from Ukrainian and Russian. To test that something is wrong, I use screwdriver and Masha. So general names. You are a rude person. You are a pain in the butt. These are different ways to say the same thing, but keep minding what kind of character you talk to. So cliches and shortenings, if you cannot avoid them, because sometimes you can't avoid them, and you really have to cut, and you really have to shorten and abbreviate. This is how we do it. This is how it was to the left, and the right column how it becomes. If we have a separate word low, and we don't know what is it low. Low probability, it's one ending. Low difficulty is another ending in Ukrainian or Russian. So we cut it, the low, for nizk. It's in Russian or Ukrainian as low without the gender ending, because it can be applied to anything, and you have no way of knowing in advance. So this is what we use. If you have done something, then we say, well, you're lucky you've done it without the gender ending. But in this case, we avoid putting the gender in the word. We try to avoid by several methods. We use general gender words, like no good or good for nothing, because good for nothing in Ukrainian is applicable to any gender. So we try and maneuver around it. And the last example here is not about a person, it's about a thing, inanimate object, and we don't know which gender is this inanimate object, so we neutralize it quite legitimately. Now, avoiding variables. Here's another time we encounter this phrase. Normally, some 70% the game consists of these kind of phrases, partially because variables are represented as parameters that a designer may not know in advance. It can be a player name that they introduce in the code, or it can be a race or a class that a player selects, and the designer has not yet implemented that, so it can be just a temporary statistics. Sometimes it's a typical repeatable phrase that is repeated all over the text many times, and the developer is too lazy to say touch an oven to get bread, or touch a workshop to get tools, or touch wood to get planks. He says, touch this to get this. So instead this and this, he will set variables, nouns in a nominative case, and the developer is too lazy to help us somewhat. On the other hand, if you get an X of screwdrivers, then X can equal either 1 or 4 screwdrivers, or it's 10 screwdrivers, different gender ending. And we don't know in which case it will stand. It will stay in the text, and you have to avoid these gender endings. If it's something typical, something very redundant, we can cut it. But sometimes we have to be really tricky in trying to avoid it. This is how sometimes we do. Here, with bold, you can see words that are replaced, that replace the variable in the text. So if we translate X, you've got X as you've got shovel singular. Then we use the singular. If you touch the kitchen 4 times, kitchen has a different gender ending, and we don't use it. This is how I frequently see the way text looks. You should avoid that, especially this one. Raz-a. This is the easiest way, and it works well with legal, normal kind of text, technical text. But if it's a game, then again, we try and translate in a literary way. No, better not do that. It's better cut and shorten instead. And use touch no less or more than 3 times, or just 3x times in Ukrainian or Russian.
Again, I will just stay here and show you the slide and let you read it, because I have been preparing for an hour or so. Yes, everyone shall admire this slide. So what we don't want, but we have to do, what stands under this title. This is a frequent thing. Normally, we are supposed to do it like that. And if we can do it like that, I am happy. I hope that you have admired this slide, and I hope that you liked it. I gave my best. Okay, the specificity of the material. On the one hand, so this is in terms of translator skills. If a medical translator or oil and gas translator can study their topic thoroughly and keep working within this particular topic, we are supposed to be the so-called scanners, because today we translate a game on a medieval age. Tomorrow we translate a game on hockey, and the day after tomorrow we translate a game on World War II. So our most important skill is to be able to Google quickly enough, and to be able to use the slang dictionary, and to have as many specialized dictionaries as possible, and to Google quickly. But even though it is clear that every game is unique, but some things are systematic, and we know that attack is the probability to hit the target. We know what power is, what health is, what endurance is, and we can understand approximately how a game works. And we realize this is a typical fantasy with a very complicated scenario and complicated story. And this is a typical Chinese thing and I don't want to have anything to do with it. And an experienced translator understands that game is a systematic thing. I used to have a colleague who translated a seaside game. And there was a dossier on all the team members. And the translation went as an application form with the color of the eyes, and it said blue black or green black. Then fair brown, and then brown brown. And he said, my colleague said, I don't know what means brown eyes, hazel eyes, and what means brown hair. And I told her, well, my colleague, you just translated blue and black. So this is a sign that the translator doesn't have a clue about the systematic nature of this translation. Okay, the context. The context influences us. So the older versions of the game influence us. The fandom of the game influences us. So the fans are already used to some kind of things. And connected pieces of creativity, they also influence us. So Bayazar is Bayazar, and you can do nothing about it. People are just used to it. And here is where I give the floor to Fyodor. Thank you very much, Yulia. Let me start my presentation. Can you hear me, guys? I hope you can hear me. All right. If you cannot hear me, please let me know. We can hear you, Fyodor. We can hear you well. Great. All right. You must not only hear me, but see me. And I must start with the very slide that Yulia stopped on and go on. All right. Yulia spoke about how our work looks from the view of a translator, and I will speak about my story from the point of the management. Surely management of game localization has very much in common with translation management and management as such, but there are some specific features that I would like to mention and go deeper into detail. Okay, let's go on. Well, let's start. So, in the first place, management. Sometimes people, or often people, call themselves localization project manager, but knowing what we deal with, things we deal with is not project management, but crisis management. So I have stolen this slide from a presentation of my colleague, who is a more experienced manager, Michael Schmidt, who has done his PhD on this particular topic. So if you are a localization manager or a localization manager on the side of the agency, you have little influence on the deadlines and on the decision makers. You are rather as a tennis player who plays with a tennis automate machine, so some tasks just fly on you and you need to come up with an idea how you shall tackle this task. It doesn't happen every day, but if we consider the shift of the game development to agile methodology, in the direction of agile methodology, it looks like people have written some sprint and we must quickly translate it. We cannot see the bigger picture. And the team gets nervous because the team doesn't understand anything. The team gets confused. You as manager get confused. And this is a stressful kind of thing. And you just have to get used to it, especially if you are an old-school localization manager of the 90s or early 2000s, when you have got the project and you calmly get down to it and start working on it. This is a different story. All right, let me tell you a little bit about the teamwork. Julia has spoken about it a little bit, and let me use the opportunity to make an analogy to the already mentioned Game of Thrones manager. So any manager is a kind of Jon Snow. His task is to help tackle problems that fly on you, and they will keep flying on you. There will be much of text and very strict deadlines and problems, issues with formats and amount of information, which Julia already mentioned. But managers are a very diverse folk. If we take the sphere of game localization, so this is some kind of meme on the one side, but as you know, a joke has a joke in it. So people that have to do with games, they are normally creative and very sensitive. And you must be very accurate in communications and moderate the discussions in terms of words you choose. And you must prepare your team for things that are not 100% comfortable. But we must do it the way that the team can tackle it and work as a team to make a very good game localization. And you must share the pain with your team that very often it cannot be a good result out of the reason that Julia already mentioned and I'm going to mention further on. And one of the reasons being can be seen on the slide. This is a screenshot of a game. It is clear, so you can see some houses, some units, everything is written. So you can see a word house under the house and what the translator sees. So for the translator, it is kind of shock, especially when people come to this sphere, to this area from some fan communities who are used to hate the localizer teams. All right, so I will not tie you with this story. We, as Julia already mentioned, have very few contacts. So one of the main tasks of the manager in game localization to give the team as much context as possible to let people work like that. Sometimes it is just impossible. I will show you a screenshot. I hope it is seen on the screen, but to be on the safe side, I will retell it. So you can see in the upper part a question from the contractor to the manager, and lower below you may see the questions from the manager to the translator. So it can sometimes happen when there is no channel of communication, and it is painful, and it is very painful to transfer these kind of answers, replies to the teams when you realize that nobody is going to help you. But these things happen, and if you want to be a game localization manager, you must get used to this kind of situation. So another part of the story is as follows: to be able to effectively prepare files for the team to work on them and to fulfill the task I already mentioned. So to give the team maximum of a context and don't disturb the team, you must prepare the files and be a little bit of an engineer. In many companies, they have engineers among their staff members, but this does not always happen. And if you have an engineer, you must give the engineer a very clear assignment. the way that the engineer understands what he or she is supposed to do. So this is one of the examples I would like to give you. So you may see a Word document. There is some formatting there. You can see a piece where it is written what they have to translate, what they don't have to translate, and on the right, this is the same document in the translation software source. So there are locked pieces which are not supposed to be translated, and the not locked pieces shall not be translated. This is a simple example. There are more complicated examples. So this is a quite normal table. Again, if you want to work in this area, you must get used to the fact that the game is a program, and the game data are stored in databases. And what you have as an input will be Excel, CSV, or any kind of other databases. So normally it is an Excel database. So this is an Excel database, an extract from a game you need to translate. As you may see, there are many columns here. An unexperienced person can give it all to translators, although not everything, in fact very few things, need to be translated here. A frequent situation is when people decide, here we have the original text, we need to get it translated, and we don't need anything. And this is the way we lose critical context, which we need necessarily for a good localization. So you need to analyze these files, you need to look at them. As you may see in red, there are parts which must be in the resources for the translator and editor teams. And again, so this is again a screenshot from MemSource software. So we have left a line for translation, and there is a context. So we have a sound file that we can possibly listen to if we have questions. We know who is speaking, what is the situation, and what's the context. So this is the way we make our job easier. But this is still not the maximum amount of the context, but it is still more than a situation if we just see the word help without any context. We don't know who is saying help and under what circumstances. Okay, let's go on.
Since we never have the full context, and we get this context, we accumulate it as we work, we have to communicate with each other. We have to communicate with each other a lot. We have to communicate with the developers a lot if they do communicate with us. Here's on this screenshot, this is a typical questions and answers file of communication with developers. It looks like a Google table, or it's just an Excel, but it's a pain to collect these Excels into some kind of clear body of information. And the best way is to use a Google Doc where editors and translators write questions, and then designers pop up and answer those questions. Below, you have a screenshot with card system, trial version, and Notion. It's a tool that we use. Everybody uses different tools, but the idea is that as we work on a project, it's very good for you to have a unified, clear repository of information where all of your editors and translators, in an ideal situation, also a customer can be there answering some kind of questions, and all that information is stored there, all the information's cleared, all the questions cleared, all the problems, references to game design, doc, the screenshots, everything is there. And everything that we have found out as we worked on the project. For instance, if we work with a big project, then somebody may have a piece of text where part of the information is not explained about a particular character, and another part of the text it is then disclosed and described. So somebody stumbled upon it, gave this answer to everybody. Now everybody knows that this particular character has this context in this situation, and all the team now knows this context, and the work is now much better and much more consistent. So to wrap up this part of the information and communications, when we send all of that by mail in the year 2020, it can be compared to quill and an ink, using email. There are many more ways to pass information and to collaborate on information nowadays rather than just an email, especially in game localization. In our industry, mostly it's distributed teams and freelancers hired to do this project. If we sit in one room and use whiteboard, talking to each other, it's one way of working. But this is 2020. We have to use different tools, much more flexible tools, to store and process information. These are some kind of the names that I'm using quite frequently, but we might talk about platforms in a different conversation. I just wanted to point out that it's super important tools that you can use that can deliver a job. And that's where the manager has to know for localization purposes, to organize a proper, quick, and understandable communication between all the team members and everybody involved. So now to wrap up what I've been telling you, I quote the Stephen King, whom I love and respect so much. It works in general in life, and it works in any management situation. It works in any translation project situation, and it works in the game localization situation. When you want to manage something or organize something, you have to always be prepared for a failure, for something going wrong. Something will break. The translators will fail to deliver on deadline. You will be held responsible. You have to figure out the way to deliver a project with all these complications on your way. So, Julia, pass you the floor to wrap up our presentation. Thank you, Fedor. So I hope you now have an idea that game localization, you should better go to do something else than game localization. It's terrible. Don't go there. We are short. We have a great competition for any vacancy, so don't go there. Do you have any questions? Thank you. It was very interesting because I was not much informed about your industry. Thank you. My question is, could you share if you have some internal tricks? How do you do quality control, quality assurance of a project? Who's doing the proofreading? Who's responsible in the end for the final product? Because so that you avoid the situation you had gray wolves one part of the game and suddenly they turned into forest wolves in a second part of the game. Thank you. So usually it's either one publishing editor or chief editor, right, Fedor? Am I right? Well, Julia, you can answer the way you see it from your side of the work, and I will then say what I see. For me, as an editor who sends to the customer our final version of translation, already proofread and very consistent translation. On the other hand, after that, the manager, well, sometimes they read after us, sometimes they are the final proofreaders sometimes. Then there are some updates and corrections from the customer if they are. Sometimes, well, usually it's an Excel table that they send. Here's English, here's your translation, and we have to do this, the third column. And the fourth column, explanation why. But usually I am as an editor, I get that. And as an editor, I say, why? Because here, if you do this, it's going to work differently in terms of neutrality of your gender. Here, with this thing that you want, we have a limitation. We can't go the way you want. This is the most concise translation possible. Here, yeah, this is, we screwed up here. We accept that. This is a matter of taste, but if you like it, okay, but don't take it as a bug, please. So that's how the communication goes. And then I send this final response file through the manager back to the customer. Well, I can comment a little bit, replying to the initial question, who's responsible for the final quality assurance? In reality, often nobody is responsible in a true sense. There's a publishing house. The publishing house has to publish the game on a certain market. And they have a localization and they have a testing. In my internal understanding, localization without testing doesn't exist. And you should test everything, absolutely. But at the same time, there can be different bad options. You know, there's no good option. In this current market, there are just different bad options. First bad option is there's no testing whatsoever. We just compile the version and nobody knows what's there. Does it work? Do the variables work? Do the fonts work? They're nice. There is consistency. Nobody knows. That's the first bad option. Second bad option is slightly better than the previous one. When you get the testers to play test everything in their own community without any connection to the translator team. They're in a different world. So they play it, test it, they edit it. They're great test and play testers, but they're outside of the context which the translation guys did. So instead of doing together, making a great localization together, they start arguing, they start fighting and bickering. And there are all kinds of weird editings from both sides. And since nobody wants to leak some information or to share something they don't want to share, the testers are in a bubble. They're not communicating with the outside world. You know, the AAA big projects, high-level blockbuster games, the testers there, they test it somewhere in a nuclear underground vault where there's no internet, no phone, and they're blindfolded. Okay, I'm joking, they're not, but they physically cannot communicate with anyone. They just pass everything to the coordinator presses it to their own coordinator, and then through a bunch of coordinators it arrives to the translator team. So how it works slowly, and secondly, a lot of information is getting lost, so that's the second bad option. And of course the manager, for me, I was terrified, because you put everything you could in there, but in the end it's just crap. You haven't seen a build, and it doesn't work. But there's a better option. When you work in an internal localization department where you have everybody together, translators, editors, testers. So I know only one publishing house where they have this great localization. I don't see it much around the market anywhere else. Maybe I'm mistaken, but hopefully I answered your question. Are there any more questions? Then I have a question. You said that localizing games is an orphan, that not many people understand what's the value of it. I personally understand full well the importance of this industry. One of the admirers of this industry is my son, and sometimes I hear him scream, "Oh, now I know how to use naked flesh in this game because the translator translated it in a weird way. So users add different new slang to this. So where can a slang get into a legitimate language? So sometimes it's up to the situation. Like the word harya, which is a bad face or ugly face. When they use this kind of word, I don't like it. But in one game where I participated as one of the editors, there were bodybuilders. Oh, there were cultists. And I got so confused because if we're talking about meta text, we have a setting of a game. We seem to be elves with swords in hand, and we act within a certain plot. That's one thing. But there's a meta text which says plus 12 to health, or they use different slang words for stats, for different stats. And sometimes it sounds well, and I would allow that. But cultists, they were suddenly in a setting, so servants of a certain cult. In Russian, the word has a different other connotation. So for me, as I said, this is the final line. You don't have to put so much slang in a proper game setting. So charisma, to use the Russian word harya, which is a ugly face, instead of charisma, that's one thing, and I wouldn't allow that. Thank you. Next presentation will be in 10 minutes.